lots of issues to wrestle with, and lots of opinions to be heard. So I want to welcome to the stage Nancy Ancrum, the editorial page editor for the Miami Herald, who will lead our first discussion on the election shakeout as we look ahead to 2020. Nancy, good morning.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning.
And I am going to be introducing next Rachel Smolkin. She is the Vice President and Executive Editor of CNN News. CNN Politics. Thank you. And also Marc Caputo. He is a senior political writer for Politico. Welcome both. Thank you so much for being here. The good thing is we're not really looking back at the recently concluded almost elections, because that will make everyone queasy. We are looking forward. And of course, we are in the middle of not only a recount, but a troubled recount. Looking forward to 2020, what must Florida, the leaders, the stakeholders, the rest of us do to make sure that this process does not continue to make us the problem child of the country? What needs to happen, especially technically? Mark?
Well, it's early, and so I'm tempted to be inappropriate.
You're among friends.
Yeah, at least it's not being live streamed. It's a joke. So, well, I think step number one is get rid of Brenda Snipes. I think she finally saw the writing on the wall. The Broward County election supervisors now realize what basically everyone realizes, and that she's running a really incompetent operation at the Broward Elections Office. I think Susan Booker, the Palm Beach County Supervisor of Elections, might have a pass here. She's having major problems, in part because of she's using the only elections hardware that, even though I dearly liked her, Teresa Lepore, the infamous Supervisor of Elections from the 2000 elections, she bought a certain type of voting machine, which is now causing major problems. In fact, last night they overheated. They had to recount 170,000 ballots. But that gets to another point. The state of Florida, just as it did in 2001 and then in 2006, it needs to again look at the elections code and plow more money into elections machinery. And in addition to that, we've now seen a flurry of last-minute lawsuits from Senator Bill Nelson. Even if they succeed at the federal district court level, they're probably going to be overturned by the 11th Circuit because it's just too late. You know, you can't challenge long-standing law, usually, that you could have challenged long before after the election because you're losing. It just doesn't work that way. But the lawsuits do point out a great number of problems with Florida law and Florida election code. So overhaul the election code, put more money into the elections machinery, and also put the supervisors of elections on notice that if you run an incompetent shop, you should go elsewhere.
Rachel.
Mm-hmm. I think Mark did a great job at addressing the technical issues. I would zoom out a bit to say there are fundamental issues of democracy involved here. And at a time when we as a nation are arguing over the most basic facts, to have a repeat of 2000, of Bush versus Gore, but at a time when our process has become so heated, so overheated, really opens us up as a democracy on the most fundamental level of standing up and voting and having your votes counted. So I think restoring that faith is going to be a bedrock principle moving forward, because we've already seen, we saw immediately allegations of fraud where there wasn't evidence to support it, or conspiracies that come to the fore so quickly about this and about everything. So to get those fundamentals right, ballots that people can read and understand, and machines that can count them properly, and a timely result, that is so bedrock. And clearly, it's going to come up again in election after election until it's dealt with in a way that really restores confidence to the system.
Rachel, Mark, Nancy, pardon the interruption here. Just like a absentee ballot, we have found another panelist here.
It's like the
Putney.
Who, right? He's just coming on late.
WPLG Television. Michael, please, welcome.
Good to see you, sir.
Hey, Mark.
Hi. Nice to meet you. I like the rolling coverage. It's a very live news event. I love it. So I think that it really goes just to such core issues of our democracy. And to be here again in the same space, I'm having major flashbacks and feelings of deja vu. I'm sure all of you are as well. But I think it comes across differently now than it did then.
Question, who is responsible for restoring that crumbling bedrock that you're talking about? The lack of trust, the open hostility to the election process, to the media, which cover the election process, candidates themselves, ideology.
Yes.
Who is responsible for restoring bedrock?
I would say all of the above, from the local level. I mean, whether that's Brenna Snipes or the President of the United States and everyone in between. And it has to start at the local level, right? I mean, local communities, that's where the trust is. We know at the national level now, and I'm steeped in it in Washington, that trust is so much under siege. On all sides, but at the local level, I think those bonds are stronger, and that's a really great place to start. But the responsibility goes all the way to the top, to the President of the United States, to the Congress, to the leaders. And if everyone at every level doesn't take some of that responsibility, I think it'll be very hard to get our democracy to the right place for 2020.
And to piggyback off of that, I think all of us is a good way to also say it, is that understand that politicians who pander and people who knowingly consume fake news or essentially look for it or fall for it, well, there's a demand side of the equation problem. And until that's fixed, and I don't know how it gets fixed, I'm pretty fatalistic about this. I think we're on a path of doom until something kind of magical happens.
Michael, are we on a path of doom between now and elections 2020?
Only Marc Caputo would talk about a path of doom.
Good morning.
But good morning, Mark.
Morning.
Would you like some coffee with your
I would. I think Mark on our Sunday morning show once called Congress, and I'm using a euphemism, a bunch of jerks, but you were right.
But they're representing their constituents.
I agree. And, you know, the larger question, and forgive me, I'm sorry
Who are you calling a jerk?
No one here or anyone watching.
Us. I apologize. Aventura's a long way away on a morning like this. I think what I'm looking at in the larger picture of this election is how deeply purple our state is. And if you didn't believe that before, you know, look at an election where the Senate race is roughly, 12,500 votes apart. And I don't really see much chance of civility returning when the apparent winner in that race, Rick Scott, is calling Bill Nelson a sore loser and rampant fraud, and doing that on the steps of the entrance to the governor's mansion in his capacity as a candidate. I just think this is not the way to begin a Senate term. I'm not trying to put it all on Rick Scott. There's enough to go around, including for us in the media, for sort of feeding the beast.
Mm-hmm. We're all involved in the media. How do the three of you plan to take responsibility between now and 2020 for helping to shore up what Rachel called the bedrock of trust in the process, trust in our democracy, informing people at a time when many people aren't listening except to their own echo chambers? Mark?
Well, I'm just going to blame other people for my errors.
There you go.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's too early for jokes. So I think one of the things that we had a problem in this election that is on us is we grew so accustomed to our electronic media in the larger sense and instantaneous information, that the Senate race was called a little early relative to what wound up being the final results. And we should have prepared audiences, readers, the public, for the idea that, look, unofficial ballot returns were due a number of days later. The election was on Tuesday, they were due Saturday. And the reason for that is votes pour in. And then final official returns are due 5 days or 10 days after that. So informing the public just like, hey, look, we don't have to make an instant call on a race because it's Florida, and very often if you flip a coin to see who's going to win, head or tails, in an election it could land on its edge, and that's essentially what we had here. There's kind of a broader point of restoring trust, and it's not always easy because, again, I spoke about the demand side of the equation, where folks who want to read that the Democrats love fraud are just going to go to the democratslovefraud.com. And the people who think Republicans are evil are going to republicansarevil.com. And there's not a lot of space here, and we in the mainstream news media who try to get it right and who don't play favorites are kind of squeezed in between by demand and market pressures. But nevertheless, we must endure. And I think one way to restore that confidence, or at least show people that there's another path, is just to continue to do our job and not hyperventilate so much.
Rachel, as Vice President and Executive Editor of CNN Politics, are you partially to blame for early projections? Can you talk about the pressure to make early projections?
Of course. I don't, to be honest, I spent election night in the control room at CNN. It's a huge night for us. We feel a very deep sense of responsibility to get those calls right, to hold off, and on many calls that night you did see us holding off in the Senate race here included. So I don't think it's so much a pressure to call early, because we have a really smart and careful decision desk, and they're in our ears all night saying, yes, we're looking at these results, we feel ready to go, or we're not. I hear you telling us that other networks have made this call. We're not there yet. We don't think there are enough votes in, or we don't have the votes from the right places, and we are just not comfortable going there. And we say, well, okay, we're going to keep checking in with you, but we won't go there until we're ready. I do think that Marc's point about setting up expectations for our audiences, that election night is a big night. It might not be the only night. This might continue. I think we can do a better job at that. So I think that we, in the past few cycles, because we could, or at least we thought we could, posit a sense of finality that is not really there anymore because of the way the election system has evolved and the votes are counted. So I think we can do a better job in future cycles setting up that expectation as audiences are reading on digital or watching on television or looking on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook or Apple News or wherever they're interacting with the content. I think that's something that we can take and think through a bit more for future cycles. And CNN last night, some of you may have seen, did Election Night in America Continued, acknowledging the fact that we are not done with the midterm elections here and elsewhere. They're still going on. So I think, again, that was a good way to revisit. We need to think about how we can keep revisiting, how we can keep informing, how we can go back and say that initial impressions on election night, for example, of how the Democrats did nationwide, that looks a little bit different than it did a week ago. And so we need to keep going back and looking at those numbers and saying, here's where we thought we were, here's where we are now. We'd initially said it didn't look like a blue wave. You can argue about what number constitutes a blue wave, but it looks certainly more like that than it did a week ago at this time. So I think that's important, to keep going back to the numbers and the reporting and explaining and just being as transparent as we can with our audiences about here's what we knew then, here's what we know now, here's what we're still waiting on, here's the picture has changed this much, it might continue to change. And I just think that transparency is really important. And I started with accountability, so I would say that very much applies to the media too. We feel that responsibility very heavily to try to get it right. And when we don't get it right, and sometimes we don't, to be as transparent as we can with our audiences in saying, this is what we got wrong, and this is the correct information. And I think that's more important now than it ever has been.
Thank you. Michael.
Well, as they almost always are, election night was, for me, a good dose of humility. I try to think, contemplate, mediate on when I saw the results where I made errors and assumptions. We journalists should never make assumptions, and we should never, I reminded myself after 2016, rely too heavily on polls. Polls are, as we all know, a snapshot of voters' sentiment at any given time, but they're not all created equal. Marc has done some great reporting about various polls in the state of Florida. In this particular cycle, a normally good poll, Quinnipiac, was just off by several miles, and some less reliable polls were much closer to the truth. The other thing I would say is that going forward, my North Star, my goal is accuracy, fairness, and civility. And trying to practice that as best I know how. I've been doing this a long time, half a century, and I think I know how to do that. And the other thing that's important for me is to do whatever I can to be both living in a factual world, an empirical world of cause and effect, and to point it out when other people in public life, the president, doesn't live in a fact-based empirical world, but to do that without hostility, without aggression, as best I can. I mean, for example, 2 days ago or so, a day ago, when he tweeted out that there were election ballots in Florida that were forged. My initial reaction was, excuse me, what bullshit? But then I thought, whoa, whoa, whoa. All you have to say is that there is no evidence of forged ballots. There is no evidence at this moment of voter fraud. There's plenty of evidence of incompetence or simply being organizationally dysfunctional as they have been at the Broward County Elections Office. The one thing also I think about is as we go forward, the older I get, the longer I've practiced journalism, I know less and less about objectivity. And I hope I know more about fairness, because my ultimate goal in reporting politics is trying to be fair.
Feels like afternoon.
It feels like afternoon. Sorry to jump in, but want to move on to the questions and answers. I'm George Hodge. I'm project manager for the Influencer Series and for this event. I am going to be sort of your voice today, relaying the questions that you text to that number. So I wanted to jump in first with, we have a couple of questions on this, which is specifically for each of the panelists. What does 2018 in Florida tell us what 2020 will look like in Florida?
Marc?
Who wants to go? Okay, right. Why don't I get the hard question? I think it'll tell us what we see now is that, again, flip a coin, Florida's going to probably land on its edge. We have razor-thin election margins, and that's almost an exaggeration now. Before 2018, is it 2018? I can't even remember the day, let alone the year. You know, the 4 past top of the ticket elections were decided by 1.2 percentage points or fewer. And this one, at both the Senate and the gubernatorial level, will be decided by even less than that. Kind of structurally, or the mechanics of getting out the vote, I think what we've seen, it started under Barack Obama, and you saw it in 2012, but we didn't realize it. It was accelerated under President Trump, and now we know it's happening, is white people are starting to vote like non-white people. That is, there's a coalescing of the white vote that is heavily trending conservative and Republican, just as the non-white vote has for a while coalesced and trended strongly liberal and Democrat. And that is a fundamental problem, more so considering the turnout patterns for Democrats than for Republicans, because in the end, 63%, for instance, of the voter rolls now in Florida are non-Hispanic white. But about 68%, and it might be higher because we don't have the election day numbers in, but at least 68% of the turnout was white. And if you have one group that is disproportionately showing up and voting, and disproportionately showing up and voting for one party, the other party is going to be disadvantaged. Now, all of these things can change with candidates and with time, but we saw here is that I've never seen such an unprecedented, and I guess that's redundant, effort by Democrats and the liberal coalition to turn out the midterm vote. Andrew Gillum worked 3 times harder than Ron DeSantis. More money was spent by the Democrats across the board, including in the Senate race on TV. For once, Rick Scott was outspent, at least it was as of Tuesday, on television.
Right.
Nevertheless, they lost.
Rachel, let me ask you from the national perspective, what does Florida now mean in 2 years? Are you going to be shipping a bunch of people down here? Does Florida become more important?
I have shipped a bunch of people down here. They may still be here. Yes, it's a very conflicted state in a very conflicted nation. And I think that the tensions and the trends that we're seeing nationally are very much playing out here in Florida. This election was so interesting because we all grew up with the adage, all politics is local, and that's been the touchstone for political reporters for so many years, but doesn't entirely seem to be true right now. This was really a national midterm election in a way that we don't usually see in politics, and you saw that reflected in the exit polls where so many people were either casting a vote against President Trump or for him as his supporters turned out to vote too. And he was very active here. He was very active in rallies in the final days of the country. So in many ways, the midterms are always to some extent an endorsement or a rebuke of the president and his party. But I think that resonated much more this year than we usually see that. I think we saw it play out in a different way. And people in demographic groups across the country showed a sameness in patterns. Like there are some national conclusions you can draw from this election. So in that sense, Florida may be ground zero of a lot of the emerging trends, the interesting demographic patterns we're seeing across the country. The youthful energy in the Democratic Party, which has become, which is very diverse, very suburban, very urban, and then the very different way in which voters in the Republican Party have shown up. And those are trends you see across the country. Mothers emerging as a voting bloc in this election, younger people, and all of the younger emerging voices in the Democratic Party in the House of Representatives, some still running in races that haven't been called. So I think those are all points that we'll be looking at and exploring here and all over the country as we head into the next election cycle.
You know, it's not just, you said it used to be elections were local. Elections also used to be Democrat and Republican. And the question we have from a reader is, increasingly the labels seem to become progressive, liberal, socialist, ultra-conservative, right-wing. Are we, and is the media, damaging and dividing America by moving to those kinds of labels?
I think there are always going to be labels. I mean, progressive is the new euphemism for liberal. Everybody knows progressive means liberal. I'm old enough certainly to remember when Buddy McKay ran against Connie Mack, and his Connie Mack, really a lovely guy, used a kind of a nasty phrase, "Hey, Buddy, you're a liberal." And Buddy wasn't. He was really kind of center-left, but it worked. So, you know, whatever we call the candidates, it really matters is how they characterize themselves. As we know, Andrew Gillum, for example, after he had campaigned with Bernie Sanders, I and every other reporter said, "Are you a democratic socialist?" And he repeatedly said, "No, I'm a Democrat. You know, I'm on this end of the spectrum, perhaps, closer to Bernie, but I am a Democrat. I believe in capitalism." So he sort of got around that. I guess, Mark, I would ask you, and Nancy as well, one of the things he didn't get around was the accusation, as absurd as I thought it was that he wanted to turn Florida into Venezuela. Well, if you say that in South Florida, where there are a lot of Venezuelans who fled, not to mention 1 million Cuban Americans who had to flee the Castro regime, and Colombians and others, Nicaraguans who have fled oppressive totalitarian governments, boy, that's got some resonance.
How many people believe that, though? I mean, you know a lot of people from Venezuela who thought they were conservative in Venezuela and come here and think, oh my God, I'm a liberal. So I do wonder how much resonance that had. I also wonder how much people give stock in what President Trump says. Nowadays, information has become ammunition, and in the campaign sense. And so I think in some cases, and I can't say all, and I don't have any polling to provide any data, but the use of the slur socialist against Andrew Gillum, I anecdotally noticed among some, was just a code word for I don't like him because he's black.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it speaks to the difficulty, I think, of many perhaps less skilled candidates and their ability to define themselves as opposed to being defined. And we've seen this in past races. And so it can be quite dicey if you do not have the mega microphone or the ears of potential voters to push back.
I think the labels might be less important, as you say, than the ability to, for candidates to define themselves, and then how different branches of the two parties that are getting those labels are reacting to the candidate. I mean, in the Democratic Party, for instance, the energy in the last election cycle was really on the left. Call it progressive, call it liberal, call it whatever you want, but it was on the left. And it remains there, and you could argue there's even more of it right now. And how is that going to work if somebody like Joe Biden runs for president? Whatever you call those different sectors of the party, will he be able to ignite that energy, to mobilize that energy in the same way that a Bernie Sanders or an Elizabeth Warren can? So those are going to be the dynamics that really come into play in the next cycle.
Nancy, we have an audience question for you specifically, which is based on how divisive and polarized the parties are. Do you see any pathway or trend to any kind of an independent coalition?
An independent coalition? Yeah. What I see, and well, let me use my experience just coming right out of these elections. We, the editorial board, talked to almost 100 candidates. What pleased me most was just how nonpartisan they were, even when they were running in partisan races. Rather, they wanted to deal with the issues. They wanted to deal with the issues in an effective and practical manner, for the most part. And so I think that is going to end up being, for lack of a better term, the independent way. And many of those people actually won. We recommended a number of them, and they won. And so I think people are looking to hear less hostility. Voters are looking to hear less hostility and more practical solutions to those day-to-day challenges that we all face.
Mark, a couple of reasons.
I'm thinking the answer to that's no, by the way. Go ahead.
Okay.
I second the no.
This kind of keys up the next question, which is, Mark, people wanted you to go back to your comment on race. To what extent was this election ultimately, given the margin, decided on race, in your opinion?
Well, I don't think it was ultimately decided that way because we have a control the U.S. Senate race. I don't think race is an ostensible issue, i.e. I want to vote against the black guy or I want to vote for the white guy was the driving issue. But again, the Republican Party has harnessed disproportionately the power of the white vote. And in the end, once all of the data pours in, it's going to show, especially on Election Day, there was just a disproportionate number of non-Hispanic white voters who showed up and they voted Republican. And that's why Rick Scott is probably going to be the next U.S. Senator. And that's why more than likely Ron DeSantis is going to be the next governor. I can keep talking if you want. You got to stop me before.
Another audience question is, we can get banking right electronically. Why can't we get voting right electronically?
Right.
Great.
Well, we can. The thing is that when you have 67 individually elected supervisors and 8.2 million people showing up at the polls, and you have kind of an underfunded system, you have margins of errors in almost anything. This is not as simple as moving $1 bill from one institution to the other. And when we did try to do electronic voting in what used to be Florida's 13th congressional district, a race to succeed, of all people, Katherine Harris, the grand dame of the 2000 elections meltdown, the congressional race in Sarasota, we used touchscreen voting machines, and like 13,000 votes just disappeared. Like, where the hell did they go? So then Florida's like, oh, we can't use those. We scrapped those, and we went to a paper ballot. I mean, in the end, these things are going to happen when you have very, very close elections.
Yeah, I would point out that in Bay County, Florida, which was blasted by the hurricane, they did vote electronically. At least 150 people emailed or faxed in their ballots, and the election supervisor said, why not? I'm going to accept them.
And I think, unfortunately, the efforts to address issues like this with the voting have gotten so completely tied up in the politics that in order to make real progress, we have to, as a society and a nation, be able to separate those out to some extent. They can't get so embroiled in the politics and charges of fraud and who's getting counted that we can't just focus on the underlying issue, which is how to make the votes get counted accurately.
And just there's an old election supervisor's prayer, which is, oh God, please don't let it be close election. And the reason for that is these things happen. You have people who show up at the polls and they're like, oh, it says bubble in my choice of candidate. I think I'll circle it. And these things just occur, and now you have what we have.
I'm going to offer one last question from the audience and then turn it back to Nancy for final thoughts from the group. Would opening up our primary system lead to less extremes in both parties?
I don't know that it would lead to less extremes. I'm only casually familiar with what they're doing in California, where what is it, the two top vote getters in the primary of whatever party are then the candidates in the general election. I don't know if that would, if Florida is ready for that. I certainly think Florida is ready for open primaries. And I certainly think that independents, 27% of the registered voters in the state of Florida, 13 million, 27% are NPA, like me. And I find it undemocratic that I couldn't vote in August in the primaries.
And I think it's a demand side of the equation. George just disappeared. I'm just kind of talking to myself. It's a demand side of the equation. I think having independents in primaries would help moderate it somewhat. But in the end, when you talk to those Republican voters, hardcore Republican voters, hardcore Democratic voters, they don't want moderates. That's not what they're looking for.
That's right. I think we're just in a very polarized time in our nation and in our politics. And I think any discussions around how to approach the process differently, how to bring people together, those are great discussions. But I just think we're in a very, very polarized moment right now.
Well, my countdown clock has counted down. And I would like to thank, and I'd like you all to thank Michael Putney, Rachel Smolkin, and Marc Caputo for their illuminating chat. Thank you.
This is still on, apparently?